Okay, Ken, I want to make a video with you and chat about some of the national security concerns around TikTok. You're the top national security reporter in the country, I would say, one of them. And I know you just wrote an article about it. Tell me a little bit about what you found, because I feel like even if you strip everything else away from the ban, people still have this fear that China is controlling TikTok, and that's a huge national security threat.
Yeah, so I took a pretty simple approach. I just looked at what the leaders of the intelligence community had to say about it and tried to see what specifics they pulled together to substantiate the purported threat. So I looked at public statements and testimony before Congress by the FBI director, the CIA director, and the director of national intelligence, who oversees the entire intelligence community. And what I found was quite a bit different than the discussion you're seeing taking place, which is taken on a very alarmist tone. They didn't cite any evidence to suggest that TikTok has coordinated in any knowing fashion with the Chinese government.
Even if it's just a hypothetical threat and these people are like, okay, well, China hasn't done this yet, but it could. Is there any evidence that it could?
I interviewed a technologist, Bruce Schneier, in the story. He made the point that there's evidence that all sorts of states can do that with different tech companies. Now, the case can be made that the Chinese government is obviously more authoritarian than many other states, particularly the US. But the fact remains that a lot of these nation states, including China, as Schneier pointed out to me, can just buy the same data in the open market to begin with. And the legislation that's being proposed to force the sale of TikTok does nothing to remediate that. Schneier made another interesting point. He said during the 2016 Russian election interference, they didn't have to do anything covertly. They just bought Facebook ads like everybody else did. As he put it, surveillance capitalism that exists, that prevails over the internet today, affords these nation states all kinds of opportunities that don't require them to operate in the shadows to try to push foreign influence and things of that nature.
What do you know about kind of what's been told to these Congress members? And is it worrying? Is it things that maybe these other people that you spoke to for your story might not know about?
Yeah, so Congress gets briefed privately on these things, and they like to play games and say, oh, I know secret things that you don't know, which, is technically true, but the intelligence chiefs in public testimony to Congress, they can't talk about what's called sources and methods, how they know what they know, but they will summarize in general terms what the findings are, even if they can't go into the specifics of how. And in the public summaries, one of which was just released this week, the annual threat assessment released by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence said that the Chinese have used the platform to push disinformation and even disinformation targeted at the midterm elections, which obviously is concerning. But again, there's no evidence that happened wittingly with the support of TikTok. There's no evidence of coordination. And again, in my interviews with experts, what they said was that while all of that is concerning, these foreign influence operations by which companies are used by foreign nation states happens all the time involving all sorts of foreign governments. So there needs to be some critical perspective included in the reporting around this, which there often isn't, because a lot of times this is the first time people are hearing about some of these things and they think, oh, this is unique to the CCP. They must really have it out for us. When the reality is that unfortunately what they're doing is pretty par for the course for nation states.
How do you think that the media coverage of all of this has shaped people's perception of the danger?
Well, to a great extent, the media takes its cues from Congress, since that's the part of government that is most responsive in terms of like taking interviews. I live here in Washington. You can just go walk right up to them and ask them a question. And so some of this is echoing the kind of alarmism that you see on the part of Congress. I quote in my story, Representative Mike Gallagher, a Republican from Congress, calling TikTok, quote, digital fentanyl. And so that's kind of where we're at in terms of the level of alarm that they're approaching these issues with. And then the media repeats it. And to a great extent, I think, frankly, national security reporters tend to be kind of hawkish and accept certain presuppositions about the world that the national security state itself accepts and advances. I'm not saying that China's human rights record isn't abysmal and concerning and all sorts of things. But, when you have this kind of spy mentality of worrying about what they're going to do in the shadows and things, sometimes, as the Cold War shown us, you'll see things around every corner where perhaps doesn't necessarily exist.
Say TikTok was a communist propaganda app. We as Americans should have the right to consume that, right?
Yeah, I think you make a compelling point. And there's a very strong First Amendment case around all this. And that's why it's going to be difficult for this legislation to make it through the courts, because it's just so patently at odds with what our constitutional rights are. And I wish more people in Congress would make the case that you're making now, a principled case. Instead, it's, we need more intelligence. We need to see more things. They haven't provided the smoking gun that would make the case that a lot of people think the intelligence community is making. But there's an entirely separate case from that's just a civil liberties question that you raise.
Who are some of the people that you talked to in the article? Who did you reach out to and kind of like, what did they say?
Yeah, so I talked to Bruce Schneier, who's a cryptographer and very prominent computer security expert. And he kind of put this all in perspective and said, whatever's going on with the foreign influence, there's a distinction between the sorts of foreign influence propaganda that virtually all nation states are pushing and the idea that these companies are coordinating with them. And so I think there's a lot of fuzziness, which, does people no favors if they're not familiar with the internet. There's a difference between specifically targeting one individual and trying to find out information about the individual versus finding out broad information about demographic swathes of TikTok consumers versus starting an account on there. And I mentioned before the annual threat assessment, which led to a lot of alarm and I think, frankly, hysteria about China's relationship to TikTok. And what it found was that the Chinese government used the platform to target American politicians during midterm election. But again, anyone can start an account on these platforms. And when the intelligence community summarizes a finding like that, they will have looked into it. And if they, with all of their resources and all of their know-how and all of their authority to hack and recruit spies and steal information, can't substantiate that there was any coordination, I have to conclude that there's probably not any. Quote in the story, CIA Director William Burns, in an interview to CNN, says it's, quote, troubling to see what the Chinese government could do to manipulate TikTok. What I want to stress there is could do. He's saying that it's conditional. It's contingent on the possibility that they decide to do so. And then, quote in the story, FBI Director Wray, in a 2020 talk to the University of Michigan, said that the parent company is controlled by the Chinese government and it gives them the potential to leverage the app in ways that I think should concern us. So that's what I found again and again. They're saying the potential, the possibility, they could, but the media is losing that nuance. There's been a 3-year-long investigation by an interagency group of governmental entities to try to essentially dredge up information to substantiate this connection. And they haven't found anything. I know people at TikTok who've described it as kind of a witch hunt, and it's really difficult to produce these huge amounts of information to comply with information requests that CFIUS has, and then go about your day-to-day job and feel as though no matter what you produce, it's never enough. The fact that the CFIUS investigation hasn't produced anything to that effect makes me think that, again, it hasn't happened. It's possible it has and they haven't found it, but these are some very well-researched, powerful agencies that are entrusted with much more serious stuff than what's going on now. If they can't find it, you've got to think maybe it doesn't exist. I think that if CFIUS had found anything, they would have reported it, as would the intelligence community. And again, that's another body that hasn't done so. Where you're hearing these kind of crazy claims is from Congress, I think.
Yeah, it would be front page news.
I can't stress enough how much effort is being poured into trying to substantiate this point. This is not a marginal question that there aren't enough resources being put into. This is central to not just what's happening in Congress, but the formally articulated national intelligence strategy on the part of the intelligence community, which is to counter Chinese influence. They are the number one focus. We have transitioned away from what's called the global war on terror. That's getting drawn down. We're moving on to what's called great power competition, which means superpowers like Russia, China, Iran, and chief among them is China. There is an entire intelligence architecture designed to ferret out the kinds of information that we're talking about right now. And not just that, if the intelligence community was to find it, they are under enormous pressure from Congress to disclose that. The head of the intelligence community, the head of the FBI, they were grilled by bipartisan members of Congress about exactly this question, saying, don't you think this is a threat? Why do you think this is a threat? What can you tell us about it? And at no point did they cite anything specific because they can't. So they will play along and say, yeah, it worries me, but they can't cite anything because they don't have it.
Why not just ban the app to protect us from something that could happen?
Yeah. So when I raised that point with Bruce Schneier, he made the point that I was describing before, which is that really was the sincere concern here. You'd have to think they'd be doing something with these mass data brokers that exists in all kinds of different forms in all kinds of different countries, and about which the government is doing nothing to try to respond to. It's really scary, the kind of stuff they can just buy commercially about just demographic groups, but individuals. So his point is kind of like, if that was the sincere concern, you would find some attendant effort to respond to that problem, but you're just not.
What do you think is going to happen in the Senate? And do you think any of these concerns will be voiced, or do you think that these lawmakers are just on a tear?
Well, I think that in Congress, there's a lot of incentive to make noise and make it look like you're going to do something about this and play the crowd, because the context in which all this is happening is China is a country that polls very poorly among Americans for a number of reasons. The offshoring of jobs and production to that country over the last several decades. So there's a lot of ill will. And so when you talk about this kind of beating your chest and tough talk with China, that plays pretty well to Americans. Now, whether or not that will materialize in the form of Senate legislation, which, by the way, President Biden is on record saying he will sign if it's passed, that's a separate question. I took a look at a lot of the people making this tough talk about China and TikTok. Many of them are on the dole in terms of getting campaign contributions from Meta, Facebook's parent corporation. Now, I don't want to suggest that things are quite that simple. There are all kinds of different factors that play into politicians' decisions about messaging and legislation and things like that. But that's one factor. Joe Biden is the foremost political recipient of campaign contributions from Meta, which stands to benefit if TikTok is forced out of business or forced to be sold.
Yeah, I just think it's so telling about the amount that Meta spends on lobbying. Drew Harwell, my colleague, and I reported a year or two ago about Meta hiring this Republican right-wing company called Targeted Victory to seed disinformation about TikTok in local news all over the country. And they did so quite successfully. They use a lot of really political smear tactics on their opponents. And then they try to wash their hands like, oh, well, we never said directly, of course, that we wanted a ban.
Yeah, you don't have to be an apologist for the Chinese government. You can be perfectly clear-eyed about their horrendous human rights record and role internationally, while at the same time recognizing they are not the only bad actor. A lot of the reporting treats this TikTok case in isolation rather than discussing the rogues gallery of other power players that have their own set of interests and are jockeying for their own results in this conflict.
Yeah, I feel you can admit that China is authoritarian and bad and has done horrible things, but also recognize that banning an app that 170 million people rely on is also quite authoritarian.
Yeah, the lack of specificity is causing a lot of confusion. People that are not on the internet are having it described to them in these metaphoric terms. And that's how they blur the lines between some of the things I've been describing, which is a country just starting an account to push disinformation versus a country collaborating and coordinating with that company to try to boost that information, which is much more serious and much scarier, but which there's no evidence for. These distinctions, these nuances are completely lost in the coverage on this. And that's a real disservice to the public who might not have the information at their disposal to be able to sort through what all this really means. And they just see a headline and panic. The stakes are getting to be quite high now. I can't think of any precedent like this where a platform is widely used, not just by individuals, but business owners to conduct commerce and things. It's in the crosshairs of the federal government like this.
No, it's really dystopian. And I think we know that this is a primary way that millions of people have learned about things like the war in Israel, Gaza, what's happening to the people of Gaza. I think a lot of this is young people are being exposed to ideas that we don't like or content that we don't approve of, that we can't control. And let's have this freak out. I think a lot of people in the tech world, they also resent TikTok.
Yeah, it's really interesting, the lack of disclosure of the various conflicts of interest. We mentioned Facebook. Twitter itself is making a massive push towards short video content. So all of this is happening in the context of basically the big three social media companies, TikTok, Twitter, and Instagram Reels, and YouTube Shorts as well, all competing for the same audience, which is people that want to consume short form content. So they all have a huge interest in pushing out whoever the competition is. And none of this context is provided when these things are reported on and explained to the public.
No, and this whole idea that I keep seeing other tech reporters push, which is like, oh, we'll just, ban TikTok. You guys can just post on Instagram Reels because everyone offers short form video now. They're totally interchangeable platforms. That ignores so much of the unique functionality of TikTok, the culture on TikTok. Also, let's talk about the insane heavy-handed moderation that Facebook has moved into. I mean, Meta has just said that they are restricting the reach of all what they call political content, which touches anything that touches on social issues. So you cannot have the free and open discussions about a lot of things that you can on TikTok on Meta. I know this because I've had my own accounts restricted on there. And then Twitter, of course, run by Elon Musk, who claims to be such a free speech supporter, it literally spent the past 48 hours banning any journalist that mentioned the name of a comic book writer that is a Nazi. And YouTube, I'm sorry, but the only thing that performs well on YouTube Shorts is skibbity toilet videos. It's not a place for news and journalism, really. So the notion that we can shut down TikTok and, everybody will just use these other apps because they're also short form video ignores so much.
Yeah, the ignorance drives so much miscommunication and misunderstanding. I would encourage people to just watch some of the congressional hearings about this. And you will very quickly see that the Congress people and senators making these decisions are clearly having the platform described to them by staffers in some abstract form because the questions make it very clear that they don't know how these things work.
Yeah, my favorite was the one congressperson that said TikTok was sending Chinese spy balloons over. They don't know what they're talking about.
It's really a confluence of several different things I mentioned before, which is kind of an emerging Cold War with China, but that can have all kinds of unintended consequences, which is just to incentivize threat inflation, just like at any point in time. You just mentioned the Chinese spy balloon. I mean, do you remember how absurd that news cycle was? They were acting like it was some sort of alien invasion or something.
Yeah. And also, I think so much of TikTok is a hub for progressive activism. And there's a lot of political interests in dismantling that, not just around Israel, Gaza, but it's also this place where so many Gen Z activists, climate activists, gun control activists. And I think a lot of people in power want to take that away. They want everyone shoved back onto Meta's platforms where you can't post about politics, or on Twitter, where basically Elon Musk just decides whoever he wants to ban arbitrarily based on his own political beliefs. Again, it just goes into those free speech concerns. If I want to go on TikTok and be communist all day, I should have the right to do that. This is supposed to be a free country, and we're supposed to be able to express whatever political ideology we want to express.
Yeah, I think there's a really unfortunate age discrimination aspect underlying all of this, which is that if you look at the polling on banning or forcing the sale of TikTok, it has broad support among certainly older people, but it's when you get to Gen Z that they are vehemently opposed to it. They actually use it. When I read all this, I'm left with the impression that Congress is just cynically looking at who has the power and who has the money, and that's unfortunately not something that's democratically distributed or equally distributed. Old people have a lot more money. They vote at much higher rates. I wonder if they're just looking at it and saying, well, we can piss off these young people. What are they going to do? They don't have any power.
100%. Both Jim Himes and Sarah Jacobs, who are both two congressional lawmakers, they're on the House Committee on Intelligence, Armed Services, and Foreign Affairs. And Sarah Jacobs said, as a member of both the House Armed Services Committee and the House Foreign Affairs Committee, I'm keenly aware of the threat that the PRC information operations can pose, especially as they relate to our elections. However, after reviewing the intelligence, I do not believe that the bill is the answer. And then Jim Himes says the same thing. He says, as a ranking member of the Intelligence Committee, I have more insight than most into the threats posed by our adversaries. But one of the key differences between us and those adversaries is the fact that they shut down newspapers and broadcast stations and social media platforms. We do not. We trust our citizens to be worthy of democracy. Here is a ranking member of the Intelligence Committee saying, I've been in these meetings. I don't see a threat. So I think when you see these lawmakers like Jeff Jackson hop on TikTok and say, look, I was in these briefings and I didn't know TikTok would be banned, but like it really concerns me because of this secret information that I saw in the briefings. Well, here's a bunch of other people that were in those briefings and saying, we didn't hear anything that meets the bar for concern.
Yeah, you make an extremely important point because there's so much potential for innuendo in the national security world because they can allege things and you can't vet what they've said because they have access that you don't have. And I can tell you as a national security reporter for something like the last 10 years, with occasional access to some of these secrets, it's always less than you think. It's not like Hollywood. And there's just so much potential for deception, fraud, waste, and abuse on the part of the people that do have that access that they can wave in front of you and say, oh, you don't know what I know. And so one of the only things we can do is try to look at some of the more sensible members and compare what they're saying. Because again, you can talk about what you've seen, you just can't go into specifics. So the idea that they just can't tell you, it's not really true. It's just a huge information disadvantage that the media is not doing a great job of countering.
Well, thank you so much for chatting with me, Ken. I just felt like you'd be the biggest expert to break all of this down. So I really appreciate it. And I can't wait to see what you write next on The Intercept.
My pleasure, Taylor. Thanks for talking.